Hello and welcome back to the next video about making my 1780s front lacing stays.
So far in this stays project, I firstly made the mock-up, and I have a video about that. Then, in the part 1 video of the real stays, I prepared the pattern pieces, cut out the coutil, marked the required lines, cut out the brocade, and flatlined it to the coutil. Then stay stitched the tabs. We're now ready for the assembly. This video is part 2 in my adventure of sewing these 1780s stays. This video includes the stays assembly, arranging the layers to ensure the outer layer aligns with the inner one, and stitching the boning channels. And on we go. Here is a front piece, and here is a side piece. I line up the coutil parts of the outer layer, not the brocade, and pin them together, keeping the lining out of the way. Then I stitch with a 10mm seam allowance. Hurrah! First line of assembly is done. Next, I repeat this for the lining layer, which is easier as there is no brocade to get in the way this time. Here's where I start to deviate slightly from the instructions. I don't press the seams open, instead I press the outer layer seam towards the front and press the lining layer seam towards the back. Next, I top stitched both the outside and inside layers to their respective seam allowances along those pressed down edges. And then I trim down the excess brocade fabric. Off camera, I pinned the pieces together. Then I stitched in the ditch along the seam to join the layers. This is not traditional and not following the instructions, but this was my first pair of stays and I had limited time, so I used the techniques I'm familiar with from corsetry. This is then repeated for the other half, connecting the front to the sides, pressing the seams, top stitching, trimming down the brocade, pinning the layers together, and stitching in the ditch along the seam, joining the outer layer to the lining. And it's time for another little deviation from the instructions. I'm joining the back pieces on now, so I will be able to obtain a really smooth inside. I lined up the coutil edges of the side and back layer pieces, and then pinned them together. This was done for both sides. Then, ensuring that I don't have any layers caught underneath, I sew the seam for both sides with a 15mm seam allowance. I press this seam between the back and the side and the outer layer towards the back. and repeated for the second side. I top stitched the seam close to the edge, going slowly and gently pulling the fabric flat over the curve of the seam, trying to get it to sit smoothly. I trimmed down the brocade, trimming the different layers to different widths so as not to have any big bumps. The back lining piece was brought in and pressed. Then the raw edge of the coutil was folded under and pressed. Then left to cool under weights. At this point I was once again very worried about the fashion fabric shrinking, causing the coutil to wrinkle, but I decided to press on for now. So I pinned down the back lining, folded under the side lining so it sits under the folded edge of the back panel, and pinned down the side lining and the seam. Once the first side was done, I did it all again for the second side. The lining pieces will be secured by stitching in the ditch from the right side, sewing through all the layers of fabric. And it's time to sew, trying to stick as closely to the ditch of the seam as possible. So let's take a breath. The 3 pieces of each half are now joined together. I really enjoyed how it shines in different ways as you look at it from different angles. Viewing from the inside, we can see how the seams have come together, and we can see all the graphite lines ready for stitching the boning channels. Starting with the stomacher boning channels. After pinning the lining to the outer layer, I stitched around the lower edge to secure the layers. Then, as I did for the mock-up, it was time to go around and around, carefully following the lines, being sure not to cross a line, as that would obstruct a channel. Here is the stomacher from the outside. While the lines of stitching are purposefully matched to blend in as much as possible, you can make out the boning channels, and I'm really happy with how they came out. Before starting on the boning channels of the main stays, I needed to refill my bobbin, as there are a lot of lines of stitches in this project. And I freely admit that I really enjoy the automatic bobbin winder on my Janome 1600p QC. The stays feel floppy and soft at this stage as I commence sewing the boning channels to surround the grommets at the back. Sewing from the right side, I firstly sew 10 mm from the line of stitching at the edge. The channel for the grommets is 12 mm over from that. Then there's another line 10 mm over for the second bone. You're now seeing a closer look as I do the same for the front boning channels surrounding the grommets. I have rotated the piece around and I'm sewing from the bottom to the top. I'm happy to do this because we're on the straight grain, even though in general I always try to stitch top down for seams and top stitching. Once again, we space the lines at intervals of 10 mm, 12 mm and 10 mm. Switching to the other half of the stays, I stitched the third set of boning channels for the grommets, which are at the front of the stays for this half. Then the fourth and final set, which are at the back. At this point, I looked over how the fabric was sitting in general. I was happy with the tabs, but I realised that the brocade on the side pieces was still bunching up at the top, so I decided to unpick the top line of stay stitching, and that smoothed it out enough. After that, I trimmed away excess fabric from around the tabs. On to the rest of the boning channels, stitching from the inside of the stays to follow the marked lines, going round and around and around, trying to keep the layers nice and smooth. And with each line of stitching, the garment has a little more structure and a little less floppiness. I noticed that the transferred lines didn't always line up perfectly with the stay stitch tabs, so I adapted some of the lines slightly as I went. Next time, I think I might leave drawing the lines until this point. I tried to get as smooth a finish as possible, so I made sure not to backstitch or have knots in the middle of the stays. Instead, I stitched over lines already sewn for small sections so that I could just keep sewing forward. Once I made it through the first half of the stays, I continued on to the second. Eventually, all the boning channels were sewn. Thank you for watching. In part 3 of this series, I will add the boning, the binding, and the finishing touches. I hope you can join me then.